For most people, peace is a concept they chase, but rarely catch. For Thomas Greer, it was something he lived daily, tucked away on the quiet edge of a lake that mirrored the sky like glass and whispered to him through the rustle of trees. His home wasn't a mansion, nor was it the fanciest property on the block, but it had what money couldn't buy: serenity. The moment he'd first stepped foot on that property 7 years ago, with the lake lapping gently just beyond the tree line, he knew it was where he belonged. The lake wasn't just a view, it was a part of his soul. Every morning before the world could throw its chaos at him, Thomas would pour a cup of coffee, slip into his worn-down sneakers, and stroll down the path that led from his backyard to the water. The sun would rise slowly over the horizon, casting golden light across the rippling surface, and Thomas would take a deep breath, feeling a sense of gratitude most people forgot how to feel. He'd built a small wooden dock at the lake entrance, a modest platform with just enough room for a folding chair, a fishing rod, and sometimes a paperback novel. That dock was his church, his retreat, his reset button. Sometimes he fished, sometimes he kayaked. Often he did neither. He would just sit and listen to the chirp of the birds, the gentle lap of water, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Neighbors would wave from across the lake or paddle by and exchange friendly small talk. Thomas wasn't a recluse, but he wasn't the type to seek out gossip or drama either. He'd found a rhythm that worked for him, and that rhythm started and ended with that quiet lakeside access. His property backed up directly to the lake, which was technically community-owned, but with access points through specific lots. His happened to be one of only 2 direct paths to the lake on their side of the neighborhood. For years, there had been no issue, just a quiet, unspoken respect among residents. Everyone understood that Thomas's dock was his, even if the water it touched was shared. No one disturbed him, and he offered the same courtesy in return. His dog, Charlie, a lumbering golden retriever with a love for water rivaled only by Thomas's, had his own morning routine too. As soon as the screen door creaked open, Charlie would race down the path, tongue flapping and tail wagging, to dive headfirst into the cool water. Thomas had taught him not to chase ducks and to stay within sight, but truthfully, Charlie never strayed far. The lake was their shared playground, a place where even time seemed to pause and take a breath. Thomas had no idea how fragile that peace was, that a storm was brewing behind the neatly trimmed hedges and picket fences of his HOA-run community, that somewhere in a clipboard-wielding boardroom, his quiet way of life was being discussed in terms of regulations and access restrictions. But for now, in those early moments with the sun on his face and the lake shimmering in the morning light, Thomas felt untouchable. He didn't know that the lake, the dock, the path, all of it was about to become a battleground. All he knew was that peace lived there, and he would soon learn just how far he'd go to protect it. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. At first, it started small. A letter here, a warning there, polite, almost friendly in tone, but laced with that unmistakable HOA undertone. We're watching you. Thomas had lived in the community long enough to know that the Homeowners Association had always been a bit involved. But as long as he paid his dues and kept his yard tidy, they usually left him alone. That all changed when the new HOA president took over. Her name was Cynthia Markham, and if power had a face, it wore pearl earrings and a rigid smile. Freshly elected, she brought with her a clipboard, a mission, and a twisted sense of order. The neighborhood called her Clipboard Karen behind closed doors, and her leadership style was anything but subtle. She didn't walk. She inspected. Every bush, mailbox, and lawn decoration was now subject to sudden compliance reviews. Within weeks of her appointment, the entire feel of the neighborhood shifted. Overnight, a place that once felt like a quiet lakeside community began to resemble a suburban dictatorship. And Thomas, with his modest dock and free-spirited dog, quickly found himself on Cynthia's radar. The first citation was for non-conforming shrubbery. His hedges, apparently, were 2 inches too tall according to subsection 4.2.1 of the landscaping guidelines. He trimmed them, rolled his eyes, and thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, another letter appeared, this time for improperly stored watercraft. His kayak, which had rested harmlessly next to the dock for years, was suddenly an eyesore and a violation of aesthetic standards. Thomas felt the walls closing in. It wasn't just about rules, it was personal. He knew it in his gut. Cynthia had a particular distaste for anything that didn't align with her manicured vision of lakeside living. And Thomas, with his slightly overgrown path, his rustic dock, and his utter disregard for brown nosing, he represented everything she couldn't control. Still, he complied. He moved the kayak to his shed, hired a landscaper to remeasure the hedges, and even repainted his mailbox when she hinted that it looked faded and potentially non-compliant. But nothing satisfied her. The letters kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. One even accused him of fostering excessive wildlife presence because of a bird feeder hanging from his back porch. It was laughable at first, but Thomas wasn't laughing anymore. He started to dread checking his mail. Every creak of the screen door felt like a countdown to the next complaint. And yet, through it all, his dock remained untouched, his little sanctuary still open, still his. Until it wasn't. The real blow came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the mist still clung to the water, and the only sound was the distant splash of fish feeding near the reeds. Thomas had just poured his coffee when he noticed something odd down by the lake. At first, he thought he was seeing things, but as he walked closer, dread pooling in his chest, he realized what had happened. A fence. A brand new industrial-style metal fence now stood between his property and the lake, stretching across the public easement that bordered the water. It was tall, too tall to step over, and it had a gate sealed with a heavy-duty padlock. His dock, still visible, just on the other side, taunting him like a dream he could no longer touch. No notice, no conversation, just gone. Thomas stood there, stunned. Charlie whined beside him, pacing nervously along the new barrier, unable to reach his usual splash zone. It felt like a punch to the chest. He wasn't just fenced off from the water, he was fenced off from peace, from the life he'd built, from the very reason he'd bought the home in the first place. The HOA claimed it was about liability concerns and fair access management. But Thomas knew better. This was about control. Cynthia wanted a message sent. No one was above the rules, not even someone who'd quietly lived in harmony with the land for years. What the HOA didn't know, what Cynthia couldn't possibly anticipate, was that they hadn't picked a compliant victim. They'd poked the wrong bear. And Thomas Greer? He wasn't the type to back down quietly. It was still early when Thomas opened his eyes, the soft golden light of morning spilling through the slats in his blinds. Like most days, he didn't bother checking his phone or flipping on the news. His routine was sacred. Coffee first, lake second. The lake had always been his quiet sanctuary, the one place where the chaos of the world couldn't reach him. But this morning something felt off, even before he stepped outside. Charlie wasn't at the door, tail wagging and ready to dash into the yard. Instead, the golden retriever was sitting stiffly by the window, ears perked, and gaze locked on something outside. Curious, Thomas padded over and squinted through the glass, and his stomach immediately dropped. At first he couldn't make sense of it. A tall metal fence, gray, cold, and completely out of place, stood where the narrow, grassy trail to the lake used to begin. It stretched from one end of the tree line to the other, cutting clean across the back edge of his property like a scar. The old worn path that led to his dock was now obstructed by chain links and steel poles. A single gate had been installed directly in the center, locked with a thick black padlock. "What the hell?" he muttered. grabbing his hoodie and heading outside. Charlie followed him, hesitant and confused. As they reached the fence, Thomas gripped the cold metal and shook it slightly, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. But it didn't budge. His eyes scanned the perimeter. No signs, no notices, no construction warnings. Just a sudden wall between him and the life he'd built for himself. There had been no vote, no letters, no discussion in the monthly HOA newsletter. Nothing. He paced the length of the barrier, hoping to find a break, an open end, something, but it was seamless, purposeful, engineered to keep him out. The worst part wasn't just the fence, it was the gate, centered like a final insult, mocking him with the memory of what used to be. He bent down, inspecting the lock, and spotted a small laminated tag hanging from the latch. It read, "Private. HOA access only. Authorized use. Permitted through board approval." Authorized use. Of his dock? His private property? Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the gate as if he could will it to disappear. The sound of the lake, once, a calming backdrop to his mornings, now felt distant and muffled, like someone had turned the volume down on his peace. Neighbors soon started whispering. A few came by, unsure of what had happened themselves. One elderly couple mentioned seeing a few workers out early the morning before, moving quickly under the direction of someone in a golf cart, most likely Cynthia. But no one knew for certain. The HOA hadn't sent a notice, nor explained why his lake access had suddenly become a restricted zone. Thomas called the HOA office that afternoon, and after being transferred 3 times, he finally got a clipped, scripted explanation. "The fencing is a temporary measure," the voice said. "Due to liability concerns and community usage conflicts, the HOA has opted to restrict direct access to certain lake points. You may submit a formal request for access via board review." He couldn't believe it. His dock, on his property, was now treated like a borrowed privilege. He hung up the phone, stunned, the silence in his home as loud as a courtroom gavel. That night, Thomas sat on his back porch with Charlie curled at his feet, watching the moonlight glimmer on the water he could no longer touch. He knew the HOA had crossed a line. Not just a legal one, though that would come later, but a personal one. They had stolen something sacred from him, but if they thought he'd simply roll over and accept it, they didn't know Thomas Greer at all. By the next morning, Thomas was no longer angry. He was focused. Rage, he'd learned, was like a fire. Hot and fierce, but quick to burn out if you didn't feed it purpose. He wasn't going to yell at clouds or throw rocks at fences. That's not how you beat an HOA, not one like this. You beat them with proof, with paper, with calm, deliberate precision. He started documenting everything. Every letter he had received, every citation. He took detailed photographs of the fence, the gate, the tag with the private HOA access only warning. He even pulled out the blueprints for his property, the original closing documents, where the easement line ended and his ownership began. His dock was on his land. His path was his. And now, it was behind a lock held by someone else. When he requested a formal meeting with the HOA, the response was slower than molasses. The board wasn't available this month, they said. Perhaps next quarter. The tone was icy, bureaucratic, and clearly designed to stall. But Thomas knew how to play the long game. He had once worked in corporate law before retiring, early. The HOA didn't know that, of course, not yet. Instead of playing into their delays, he requested mediation through the community's designated conflict resolution process. According to the HOA charter, it was his right. But even that was met with red tape. The mediator, a tired man in his 60s who clearly just wanted to make it to retirement, offered no help. The board claims the fence falls under emergency liability action, he said with a shrug, barely looking up from his clipboard. They're allowed to act swiftly if there's a safety issue. Thomas leaned forward. There is no safety issue. There's just a fence, built overnight, on my access point. The mediator sighed. Well, the bylaws are vague in that section. They're flexible. Flexible. That word stuck in Thomas's mind like a splinter. It was the kind of word used by people who bend rules just enough to get what they want. But it also told him something else. This wasn't about community safety. This was about power. And the more he looked into the situation, the more he realized this had Cynthia's fingerprints all over it. She hadn't always been HOA president. Just 6 months ago, she was another neighbor, polite enough in passing, but always with a curious eye, the kind of person who paid too much attention to what others were doing in their own yards. But once she was elected president, she changed. There were rumors, of course, whispers that Cynthia had been passed over for a lakeside lot years ago, that she'd wanted the very property Thomas now owned but had been outbid at the last minute. It made a strange kind of sense now. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was rewriting them, and she was doing it with just enough legal ambiguity to avoid direct confrontation. When Thomas requested the official justification for the fence, he received a scanned copy of a bylaw clause buried deep in a 70-page document, Article 14, Section 9, Subclause D. In instances where shared community resources present a risk or challenge to consistent member access, the board may install access control measures at its discretion. It was vague, intentionally so. The phrase access control measures could mean anything: a sign, a camera, or apparently a locked steel fence cutting a homeowner off from his dock. Thomas read that line over and over again until the letters blurred. He felt the weight of it, not just the injustice, but the manipulation behind it. This wasn't about safety. This was about erasing him, isolating him, making him so uncomfortable, so inconvenienced, that he might eventually sell and leave. But what the HOA didn't know was that Thomas wasn't built to back down. He didn't scare easy, and he certainly didn't quit. If Cynthia wanted a war of bylaws and bureaucracy, she was about to find out just how good he was at playing that game. It was a conversation with the town clerk that set everything in motion. What started as a venting session at a local cafe turned into a whispered suggestion. Have you checked the parcel map lately? That part of the lake access might not be what the HOA claims. Thomas hadn't. Why would he? He had always assumed the narrow patch of land separating his yard from the water was managed by the HOA, some common space or public easement. That's what everyone said. That's what the board wanted people to believe. But the clerk's comment lit a fuse in his mind. If there was even a chance they were fencing off land they didn't own, it changed everything. He spent the next 3 days immersed in property records, plat maps, tax records, anything he could dig up. The county's online system was a mess of PDFs and overlapping maps. But Thomas was patient. He cross-referenced lot numbers, easement lines, and sale histories. He even drove to the recorder's office downtown to get original documents, stuff you couldn't access digitally. And then, buried in a stack of older survey papers, he found it. The narrow strip of land, the very one the HOA had fenced, was not HOA property. It wasn't part of the community's common use designation, nor had it been transferred to the HOA in any official capacity. Instead, it was listed under a separate parcel number marked Private Owner Unknown. Further notes revealed a history of missed property tax payments going back almost 8 years. The parcel had once belonged to a man named Walter Clements, a local fisherman who had passed away nearly a decade ago. With no living relatives found and no estate resolution, the land had quietly fallen into legal limbo. The county had filed a lien, and just 2 months ago listed the parcel for private sale, unadvertised, and intended for quiet acquisition by interested parties. Thomas sat back in his chair, heart thudding. The HOA didn't own the land. They had no right to fence it. And yet, they'd installed a gate, locked it, and posted signs claiming exclusive access. There was more. His research uncovered a purchase inquiry made by a third-party LLC, Markham Lakeside Holdings. The name hit him like a slap. Markham, as in Cynthia Markham. She was trying to buy the parcel, silently, without informing the board, without informing the community, and most importantly, before anyone else could realize the land wasn't hers to begin with. The implications twisted in his stomach. This wasn't about bylaws or aesthetics. This was about control. Cynthia wasn't just enforcing rules, she was playing chess. Locking the gate had been her first move, asserting dominance over the land. The next would have been ownership, and with it, complete authority to restrict access permanently, not just to Thomas, but to anyone she pleased. But she had made one fatal mistake. She acted too soon. The sale hadn't gone through yet. The land was still up for grabs. And as far as Thomas could tell, anyone with the right documents and the right timing could claim it. He stared out his back window, the outline of the fence casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. Just beyond it, the lake shimmered like it always had, patient and still. But this time, it wasn't just about reclaiming access. It was about flipping the game on its head. He didn't just want the fence gone, he wanted the key. Thomas hadn't felt this kind of rush in years, not since he closed his first major case back in his law firm days. It wasn't just the thrill of strategy. It was the quiet satisfaction of watching a carefully laid plan unfold while your opponent was still playing checkers. With the parcel's sale still pending and the county offices unaware of any active buyer, Thomas knew he had a narrow window, and he intended to slip through it before the HOA even knew the door was open. He moved fast. He didn't use his own name to initiate the purchase. Instead, he set up a simple holding LLC, Greer Shoreline Holdings. Clean, professional, untraceable to anyone casually nosing around. With the help of a local real estate attorney he trusted, he submitted the offer directly to the county. There was no competition, no bidding war. Just an overlooked piece of land and one man who knew exactly what it was worth. Not in dollars, but in leverage. Within 10 business days, the deed was signed, notarized, and recorded. The narrow sliver of land, the same one the HOA had claimed to protect, now belonged to Thomas Greer. Along with the parcel came legal ownership of everything on it: the gate, the padlock, the towering fence that had mocked him for weeks. All of it was now his. He could take it down, leave it up, paint it pink with flamingos if he wanted. But he wasn't interested in revenge that screamed. He preferred the kind that whispered. The next HOA meeting fell on a rainy Thursday evening. The room buzzed with usual complaints. Grass too long, trash cans left out, a dog that barked too much. Cynthia presided at the head of the long folding table, clipboard in hand, voice clipped and smug. She was in her element, until Thomas raised his hand. "I'd like to address the fence issue by the lake," he said calmly. "Specifically, the locked gate cutting through what I now understand was once unclaimed land." Cynthia stiffened. "We've already reviewed that matter, Mr. Greer. The board acted in accordance with—" "I'm sure you believe that," he interrupted gently. "But you see, I recently purchased that parcel. As of last Friday, I am its sole legal owner, which means the fence you installed is now on my property, without permission." The room went dead silent. One of the board members coughed. Cynthia blinked slowly, lips parting, but no words coming out. Thomas continued, voice even but firm. "I've already filed the updated deed with the county. The fence, the gate, the lock, all now fall under my jurisdiction. If the HOA wishes to keep any part of it in place, you'll need to submit a formal easement request to me. Otherwise, I'll be removing it within the week." The moment stretched like elastic. For the first time in weeks, Cynthia looked unsure, exposed. The smug veneer cracked, and beneath it was just a neighbor who'd overplayed her hand. Thomas didn't gloat. He simply stood, gave a polite nod, and walked out. Later that night, He returned to the fence with a set of bolt cutters slung over his shoulder and Charlie trotting at his side. The metal clanged loudly as he clipped the padlock free. He swung the gate open wide, not with a sense of vengeance, but with the quiet satisfaction of taking back what was his. The path to the lake had never felt so symbolic. The HOA had built the fence thinking they'd boxed him in. But Thomas hadn't just reclaimed the key. He'd bought the whole damn gate. The transformation was almost poetic. One day, Thomas was just a frustrated homeowner pacing behind a locked gate. The next, he was the gatekeeper himself, and the shift in power was felt immediately across the entire neighborhood. It began subtly. A hesitant email from an HOA board member, not Cynthia, asking whether Thomas would consider maintaining public access to the lake for the sake of community harmony. The tone was overly polite, the kind used when someone's not sure if they're speaking to a neighbor or a ticking time bomb. Thomas didn't respond right away. He wanted the message to simmer. At the next HOA meeting, the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Cynthia, once a confident conductor of neighborhood affairs, now fumbled through the agenda with a smile that looked increasingly strained. When the topic of lake access concerns arose, she barely made eye contact with anyone. She tried to downplay it, suggesting they were in active talks with the property's new owner to find a compromise. That was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Thomas stood slowly and cleared his throat. There's been no compromise. Just silence from your end. A few eyebrows rose. A murmur rolled through the chairs. Cynthia's fingers clenched around her pen like it was the last anchor to her authority. What I'd like to know, he continued, is why the HOA felt entitled to fence off land they didn't own in the first place, without a vote, without transparency, without even checking the records. That fence went up overnight. Was that your version of due process, Cynthia? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, the room felt heavier than the thunderstorm building outside. Then a voice spoke up from the back. Mrs. Halpern, a quiet woman from the north cul-de-sac. I never liked that fence, she said, her voice wavering but strong. I used to walk my dog down that path every morning. Then one day it was just gone. A man beside her, Greg, who always kept to himself, nodded. Thomas did what any of us should have done. He paid attention. He fought back. It was like a dam cracking. Other voices joined in, some gentle, others frustrated. Not everyone had agreed with Cynthia's leadership, it turned out. They'd just been afraid to say it. Thomas hadn't just reclaimed land. He'd reopened the idea that the HOA didn't have to operate like a dictatorship in a cardigan. Back home, Thomas received more than a few knocks at his door. Some came with baked goods, others with questions. A few brave neighbors asked if he'd consider letting them use the lake path again. He told them honestly he was open to it, but he wanted real accountability from the HOA first. A public apology, a removal of the fence on his terms, and a formal review of the board's authority moving forward. By the end of the week, Cynthia sent a request to meet, privately. She showed up in a pale blue blouse and forced a smile, but there was no hiding the desperation behind her eyes. She explained in soft, roundabout terms that she'd made a misstep, that she only wanted to improve the neighborhood. Thomas listened, arms crossed, and said nothing until she finally asked, "What do you want, Thomas?" He paused for a beat. "I want transparency. I want that fence gone. And I want you to stop pretending this HOA is your personal kingdom." She didn't reply, but 2 days later the fence was quietly dismantled. Neighbors returned to the path, with hesitant steps at first, then with laughter and fishing poles, as if the months of conflict had never happened. But they remembered. They remembered who stood up, who sat down, and who thought no one would notice what they took. Thomas didn't need applause. He had the key. And now the whole neighborhood knew who really held the gate. It wasn't revenge. in the way most people imagined it. No fireworks, no dramatic shouting matches, no cops being called. For Thomas, the sweetest victories came quietly, dressed in calm confidence and well-timed silence. After all the scheming, stonewalling, and underhanded tactics from the HOA, it was finally his turn to set the terms. And he didn't waste the opportunity. He had the deed, the land, the legal right to the only entrance to the lake. And now, he had the neighborhood's attention. With the fence gone and the path open again, his path, he invited the board to a formal mediation session. It wasn't out of obligation. It was a show of power. If they refused, he'd close the path for good, not just to them, but to everyone. The law was on his side now. Cynthia showed up, but her posture had changed. Gone was the stiff-backed control freak with the passive-aggressive tone. She looked smaller somehow, less certain, more human. The rest of the board trailed in behind her, quiet and sheepish, not a single one willing to make eye contact with Thomas. That was fine. He didn't need them to look him in the eye. He just needed them to listen. "I'm willing to keep the path open," he began, his voice steady. "But not under your rules, not with your games. If you want access, here's what. It'll cost." He slid the paper across the table. It wasn't just about the lake. It was a proposal to overhaul the HOA's bylaws, remove the ridiculous rules about lawn height, garden gnome bans, the absurd threat letters over mailbox paint chips. He wanted mandatory community votes for all structural changes, financial transparency, and term limits for board members. It was, in short, a neighborhood constitution, a document that would clip the wings of tyrants and give power back to the people who actually lived there. Cynthia stared at it in stunned silence, her fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the terms. Thomas watched the color drain from her face. She knew what this meant. The gate had never really been about the lake. It had been a symbol, and now that symbol belonged to him. "If you agree," he said calmly, "the gate stays open. If you don't, well, let's just say I've already got plans to build a lovely little greenhouse on my new land. With a fence, a taller one." There was no shouting, no argument, just a long, defeated sigh from Cynthia, followed by her quiet nod. The vote was called a week later. The community showed up in record numbers. Overwhelmingly, they voted in favor of Thomas's reforms. And in a move no one saw coming, Cynthia stood up during closing remarks and handed in her resignation, her voice thick but composed. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood," she said. "But somewhere along the way I stopped listening. And that's not leadership, it's control." The room didn't cheer, but it didn't need to. The silence was the kind that comes after a storm, the kind that settles, heavy but peaceful. In the days that followed, the lake entrance became a place of life again. Kids ran down the path, with fishing rods and inner tubes. Elderly neighbors brought out their folding chairs and watched the water ripple under golden sunsets. And Thomas, he found his peace again, often walking his dog Charlie down the restored trail, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He'd won, but more than that, he'd changed something. Not just a rule or a fence. He'd given his neighborhood its voice back, and every time he passed the spot where the gate once stood, he'd pat his pocket. The key was still there, but now he didn't need to use it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.